The girl is a slip of a thing, all sharp elbows and fierce, desperate eyes. She stands in the doorway of the Redemption Saloon, a place no child should ever cast a shadow, and her gaze is locked on the man in the corner. He sits with his back to the wall, a habit ingrained by a life of watching his own six. His hat is pulled low, his whiskey untouched. He is trying to be invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of a town that prides itself on second chances he doesn't believe he deserves. The girl, however, sees him clear as day. She takes a breath that seems too big for her small chest and marches right up to his table. "You're him, ain't you?" she asks, her voice a reedy whisper that still cuts through the low murmur of the saloon. The man doesn't look up. He just stares into the amber depths of his glass. "I'm no one you need to know, kid. Go on home. They call you Silas," she presses, her small hands twisting in the fabric of her worn-out dress. "They say you can fix anything with a gun." He finally lifts his head, and the light catches the silver at his temples and the hard lines etched around his mouth. His eyes are the color of a winter sky, cold and distant. "The only thing I fix with a gun is a problem that needs ending. I don't do repairs. Now, I told you to go. Please," she says, and the single word is heavy with a sorrow that makes the grizzled bartender pause his polishing. "My ma, she's broken, and she's near death. You gotta come." A flicker of something, annoyance, or maybe a pain long buried, crosses his face. He shakes his head, a final, weary dismissal. "No way I'm going." He turns back to his glass, the conversation over. But the girl doesn't move. She reaches out a small, grimy hand and lays it on his sleeve. The touch is surprisingly firm. "The doctor won't come," she says, her voice cracking. "And I heard you. I heard you know about things that won't heal right. Please." Her name is Clara. "My name is Elodie. You're the only one left to ask." He looks from her face, streaked with dust and tears she refuses to let fall, down to the small hand on his arm. It's a foolish, dangerous thing, a gunslinger getting involved in homestead troubles. It's the exact opposite of the quiet, empty life he came here seeking. He should say no again. He should get up and walk out. But he looks at her eyes, and he sees a ghost of his own, a phantom of a promise he failed to keep years ago. He lets out a long, slow breath, a sound like stones grinding together in a dry riverbed. "All right, kid," he says, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "Show me." Silas followed the girl out of the dusty main street of Redemption, his long-legged stride easily keeping pace with her frantic, shorter steps. The town was aptly named, a haven for men and women looking to shed their pasts like a snake sheds its skin. Silas had arrived 2 months prior, not seeking redemption. He believed some sins were too deep for that, but oblivion. He wanted a place where the name Silas Kane, a name once whispered in fear and awe from the dusty plains of Texas to the mountains of Montana, meant nothing. He wanted to sit in a quiet corner until his bones turned to dust, a final, anonymous penance. The girl, Elodie, was a disruption to that plan. She led him east, away from the meager cluster of buildings and into the vast, indifferent expanse of the high plains. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, beating down on the cracked earth. The landscape was a study in brown and gray, broken only by the stubborn green of sagebrush and the distant, hazy blue of the mountains that rimmed the horizon. It was a hard land for a man, let alone a woman and child trying to carve out a life. He watched the girl as they walked. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, but she moved with the grim purpose of someone twice her age. Her dress was patched, her shoes worn through at the toes, but she didn't complain about the heat or the rough terrain. She just kept pushing forward, her small back straight, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance only she could see. When they left the town, a few onlookers had watched them go. He'd seen the pity in their eyes for the girl and the suspicion in them for him. The town's sheriff, a man named Gable with a weary but decent face, had given him a long, questioning look from his office porch, but had said nothing. Silas was not breaking any laws, not yet. "How far?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Not far now," she replied without turning. "Just over that rise." He'd seen her in town before, a fleeting figure darting into the general store, always alone. He'd noted her solemnity, the absence of childish play in her demeanor. He'd assumed, as most did, that she was just another homesteader's child, weathered by hardship. He had never imagined she would be the one to drag him back into the world of feeling and consequence. His life was governed by a simple set of rules he'd established after everything. Don't get involved. Don't make promises. Don't let anyone depend on you. In the space of 5 minutes, this child had made him break all 3. They crested the rise, and he saw it. The homestead was little more than a sodden timber cabin hunkered low against the earth, as if trying to hide from the punishing wind. A small, tilled garden fought a losing battle with the dry soil, its plants drooping in the heat. A lean-to stable stood nearby, empty save for a single, bony-looking milk cow flicking its tail at flies. It was a place of profound poverty and struggle, but there was a stubborn neatness to it. The walkway to the door was swept clean, and a small pot of wilting wildflowers sat on the windowsill, a fragile testament to a desire for beauty in a place that offered little. This was their home. This was the kingdom Elodie was fighting for. As they approached, a low moan drifted from the cabin's single open window. It was a sound of pure misery, and it made the muscles in Silas's jaw tighten. He had heard that sound before, in field hospitals and on bloody battlefields. It was the sound of a body at war with itself. Elodie's pace quickened, her small face a mask of anxiety. She pushed the rough-hewn door open and rushed inside. Silas paused on the threshold, his hand hovering near the Colt peacemaker at his hip, an instinct he couldn't shake. The air inside was hot, still, and thick with the cloying scent of sickness. He stepped in, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. The cabin was a single room, meticulously organized to contain a whole life. A small stove, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of meager supplies. And in the corner, on a simple rope bed, lay the reason they were here. The woman, Clara, was half buried under a threadbare quilt despite the heat. Her face was unnaturally pale, slick with sweat, her lips cracked and dry. Her auburn hair, the same shade as her daughter's, was plastered to her forehead. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged affair. "Ma," Elodie whispered, rushing to the bedside. "I brought help." Clara's eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused, glazed with fever. She mumbled something incoherent and tried to shift, a sharp gasp of pain escaping her lips. Silas moved closer, his boots silent on the packed earth floor. He saw it then. Her left forearm, lying outside the quilt, was swollen to nearly twice its normal size. A dirty bandage was wrapped around it, but angry red streaks snaked up from beneath the cloth, traveling toward her shoulder. Blood poisoning. He'd seen it take strong men in a matter of days. He looked at the woman's slender frame, her body already racked with fever, and a cold certainty settled in his gut. The girl hadn't been exaggerating. Her mother was dying. Silas knelt by the bed, his usual detachment cracking under the weight of the scene. This wasn't a gunshot wound, a clean problem he understood. This was rot. This was decay. This was nature's slow, ugly violence. His first instinct, a cold and cowardly one, was to stand up, turn around, and walk away. He was a gunslinger, a killer of men. He had no business playing doctor to a homesteader's wife. He could give the girl a few dollars, tell her he was sorry, and ride on. He could get back to his mission of becoming a ghost. She cut it on the barbed wire fence 3 days ago, Elodie said, her voice trembling as she watched him. I cleaned it like she taught me. I put a comfort poultice on it, but it just got worse. The redness started yesterday. He looked at the small, determined face of the child, who had done everything she could. He looked at the unconscious woman on the bed, who was fighting for her life. And he looked at the angry red lines on her arm, a map of her impending death. He had walked away from a sickbed once before, chasing a bounty because he thought the money was more important, only to return to a silence that had screamed for the rest of his life. He couldn't walk away from this one. Boil water, he said, his voice a low command that startled them both. Elodie stared at him, her eyes wide. All you can, he clarified, standing up and pulling off his gun belt, laying it carefully on the table. Get the sharpest knife you have, and find every clean strip of cloth in this house. Now, the child didn't question him. She saw the shift in his eyes, the cold purpose that had replaced the reluctance. She scurried to the stove, her fear momentarily eclipsed by the hope he had just given her. Silas rolled up his sleeves. He looked down at his hands, hands that had brought so much destruction. He wondered, for the first time in a long time, if they could possibly be used to repair something. He was no doctor, but he had been a soldier. He had seen what surgeons did in tents that smelled of blood and whiskey. He knew what had to be done. It would be brutal, and it might not even work. But it was her only chance. The quiet he had sought in redemption was gone, replaced by the ragged sound of a woman's breathing and the frantic clatter of a little girl trying to save her mother's life. The next hour was a descent into a quiet, focused hell. Silas had Elodie hold the oil lamp close, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the cabin walls. He took the kitchen knife, a worn but well-honed blade, and held it in the blue heart of the stove's flame until the steel glowed a dull, angry red. The smell of hot metal filled the small room. Clara moaned on the bed, her body twitching as if sensing the impending violation. "Hold her shoulder," Silas instructed Elodie, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the cold dread coiling in his stomach. "Don't let her move, no matter what she does. Can you do that?" The girl nodded, her face pale but resolute. She placed her small hands on her mother's shoulder, her knuckles white. She was a soldier in her own right. Silas took a deep breath, unwrapped the soiled bandage, and revealed the wound. It was worse than he'd feared. The cut itself wasn't large, but it was deep, and the flesh around it was a swollen, purplish mess, weeping a foul-smelling fluid. The infection was buried deep. He pressed gently near the wound, and Clara screamed, a thin, delirious sound that tore at the silence. Her body arched on the bed. "Hold her," Silas commanded, and Elodie leaned all her weight onto her mother's shoulder, tears finally streaming down her cheeks, though she made no sound. Silas didn't hesitate. Delay was an indulgence they couldn't afford. He positioned the tip of the glowing knife over the angriest part of the swelling. "I'm sorry," he whispered, to the woman, to the girl, to whatever god might be listening. Then he plunged the knife in. Clara's scream was raw and animalistic. She thrashed wildly, her fever-bright eyes flying open, seeing nothing. Silas worked quickly, his movements precise and economical, born of a grim familiarity with violence. He lanced the wound, cleaning out the poison with a brutal efficiency that made his own stomach turn. The smell was overpowering. He used strips of cloth dipped in the boiling water and whiskey from his own flask to flush it clean, again and again, ignoring the woman's cries and the girl's silent, terrified sobbing. Finally, he took the flat of the hot knife and cauterized the edges of the open wound. The hiss of flesh and the sickeningly sweet smell of its burning filled the cabin. Clara went limp, mercifully passing out. Silas's own hands were shaking, not from the act itself, but from the terrible intimacy of it. It was one thing to end a life from 20 paces with a Colt. It was another to hold it, fragile and suffering, in your own 2 hands. He cleaned the area one last time and packed the wound with fresh, clean cloth. He worked in silence, his face a grim mask. When he was done, he slumped back in the chair, the energy draining out of him. The room was quiet save for Clara's breathing, which already seemed a fraction less ragged. Elodie was still standing by the bed, her small body trembling, her eyes fixed on her mother's still form. Is she?" The girl couldn't finish the sentence. "The poison's out," Silas said, his voice hoarse. "Now we see if she's strong enough to fight the fever. Keep putting cool cloths on her forehead. And try to get some water into her if she stirs." He felt 100 years old. He looked over at his gun belt on the table. It seemed like an artifact from another man's life. The night stretched into an eternity. Silas did not leave. He couldn't. He sat in the chair by the table, watching, listening to every breath the sick woman took. Elodie, exhausted but unwilling to sleep, eventually curled up on a small rug at the foot of her mother's bed, a tiny, vigilant guardian. A few times, Silas got up to check on Clara himself, laying the back of his rough hand against her forehead. She was still burning with fever. The doubt he'd suppressed during the procedure came creeping back. Had he done the right thing? Or had he just inflicted more pain, hastening the inevitable? Around midnight, Elodie stirred. She got up and quietly offered him a piece of hard bread and a cup of water. He hadn't realized how hungry he was. They ate in silence, the shared act a strange, temporary truce with the grim reality of their situation. "My pa built this house," Elodie said suddenly, her voice small in the vast quiet. "He said the soil was good. He was wrong." Silas just chewed his bread. He wasn't a man for small talk. He got a fever, she continued, looking at her mother. The kind that comes from the lungs. The doctor from Redemption came. But it didn't matter. He died right in that bed. Her voice was flat, matter of fact. She had seen death before. That explained the hardness in her, the lack of tears. After that, the doctor said it was too far to come just for us. Said we had to pay Pa's old bill first. Silas stopped chewing. He looked at the girl, really looked at her. He saw the crushing weight of responsibility she carried, the adult grief in a child's eyes. And he felt a hot, unfamiliar surge of anger. At the doctor, at the world that would let a child carry such a burden. Your ma's a fighter, he said, the words gruff but meant as a comfort. She's tired of fighting, Elodie whispered, and for the first time, her composure broke. A single tear tracked a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. Silas spent the rest of the night watching, his thoughts a tangled mess. He thought of his own wife, Sarah, her face pale with the cholera that had swept through their small Texas town. He had been gone, chasing a man for $500. When he returned, with the money in his saddlebags, he found his neighbor shoveling dirt onto 2 small graves in the churchyard. He hadn't even been there to hold her hand. He'd poured the bounty money into the collection plate and ridden away, trading his farmer's tools for a gun, convinced he was better at taking than he was at holding. Now, here he was, in a nearly identical room, with a different woman's life hanging in the balance. This time, he wasn't leaving. Toward dawn, as the first pale light began to outline the window frame, Clara's breathing changed. It deepened, becoming more even. Silas was at her side in an instant. He touched her forehead. It was still warm, but the raging, unnatural heat was gone. She was damp, her skin cool to the touch. The fever had broken. He felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He looked over at Elodie, still asleep on the floor, and a small, unfamiliar feeling stirred in his chest. He had made a difference. He hadn't run. He spent the next few days in a strange limbo. Clara slept, her body knitting itself back together. Silas found he couldn't bring himself to leave. He told himself it was to make sure the infection didn't return. But it was more than that. He fell into a routine dictated by the needs of the homestead. He helped Elodie milk the cow. He patched the section of barbed wire fence that had caused the injury in the first place. His hands, clumsy with the wire stretchers, feeling alien after years of holding nothing but reins and a revolver. He chopped a mountain of firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a soothing percussion against the silence of the plains. He and Elodie worked together, mostly without speaking. She would show him where the well pump was sticking, and he would fix it. He would notice the cabin door wasn't hanging right, and he would reset the leather hinges. Through these small, shared tasks, a quiet understanding grew between them. She stopped looking at him with the desperate awe she'd had at first, and started looking at him with a simple, trusting acceptance. He was just Silas, the man who was here. For his part, he found himself watching her, admiring her grit. She worked like a grown woman, her small hands mucking out the cow stall or weeding the garden with a tireless determination. In the evenings, he'd watch her sit by her mother's bed, sometimes reading aloud from a worn copy of a book, her voice a soft murmur. One afternoon, a rider approached the homestead. Silas saw him coming from a long way off. He instinctively put himself between the cabin and the visitor, his hand resting casually on his hip. The man was stout, with a florid face and the self-satisfied air of someone who owned things. He reined in his fine-looking horse and looked down his nose at Silas. "You're the gunslinger from town," the man said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Jed Henderson. I own this plot, and I don't recall leasing it to the likes of you." "I'm just passing through," Silas said, his voice flat and cold. Henderson's eyes flickered to the cabin. "I heard the widow was ill. Seems she's found herself a peculiar kind of nurse. Folks in town are talking. A woman of her station, alone out here with a man of your reputation. It's unseemly." Silas's eyes narrowed. "What I'm doing here is my business. What do you want, Henderson?" "I want what's owed," Henderson said, his tone turning sharp. "Clara Wallace is 2 months behind on her lease payment. I was prepared to be lenient, given her husband's passing. But this," he gestured vaguely at Silas, "this changes things. It brings a bad element to my land. I want you gone, and I want my money by the end of the week. Or I'll have the sheriff run her and the girl off." He didn't wait for a reply, just wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and indignation in his wake. Silas stood there for a long time, the anger from the other night returning, harder this time. Henderson hadn't just threatened a piece of land. He had threatened this fragile sanctuary, this small world that Silas had, against all his better judgment, started to care about. He was no longer a visitor. He was a defender. The thought was both terrifying and strangely invigorating. He had a new problem to fix, and this one was squarely in his area of expertise. But he found himself wanting to solve it without the tool he had always relied on. 2 days later, Clara woke up. Silas was outside, splitting logs, when he heard Elodie give a small cry of joy from inside the cabin. He dropped the axe and was through the door in 2 strides. Clara was sitting up in bed, propped against the wall. She was pale and painfully thin, but her eyes were clear and lucid. They were the color of moss after a spring rain, and they were fixed on him with a mixture of confusion, fear, and dawning understanding. "Ma!" Elodie cried, hugging her mother carefully. "You're better." "Elodie," Clara whispered, her voice a dry rasp. She hugged her daughter back fiercely. Then her gaze returned to Silas, who stood awkwardly by the door, feeling like an intruder. You're Silas Kane." The name, spoken aloud in this quiet room, sounded like a curse. He just nodded, his throat tight. "Elodie told me," Clara said, her eyes tracing the lines on his face. "She said you saved me." Her gaze dropped to her bandaged arm, then back to him. "Why? A man like you. Why would you help us?" Silas looked away, toward the small window and the endless sky beyond it. He didn't have a simple answer. He could have told her about the debt he felt he owed the universe, about the ghosts of a wife and daughter who haunted his sleep. But the words wouldn't come. The kid was persuasive. He finally mumbled, echoing the same inadequate reason he'd given himself. "She is that," Clara said, a faint, weak smile touching her lips. The smile transformed her face, giving him a glimpse of the woman she was without the pain and fever. There was a strength in her, a quiet resilience that matched her daughter's. Their new, fragile peace was short-lived. The end of the week arrived like a death sentence. Silas had a small amount of money saved, but it wasn't enough to cover 2 months of Henderson's inflated lease fees. They spent the morning in a state of tense quiet. Clara was strong enough to sit at the table now, though she tired easily. She and Elodie had packed a small crate with their most precious belongings, her husband's tintype, a few books, a small, beautifully carved wooden bird that Silas had noticed by her bedside. "We can go to my cousin's in the next territory," Clara said, her voice devoid of hope. "It's a long way. I don't know how we'll get there." Silas looked at them, at the resignation on Clara's face and the fierce, silent defiance on Elodie's. He thought of the road, the endless, lonely path that had been his only home for years. The thought of sending them out onto it, vulnerable and destitute, was unbearable. He had failed to protect his first family. He would not fail this one. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. He stood up and strapped on his gun belt. The weight of it felt familiar, but different. It no longer felt like a part of him, but a tool for a specific job. "This is your home. Henderson is a bully, and bullies only understand one thing." "No," Clara said, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, don't. I don't want any more violence. Not for us." "There won't be a fight," Silas promised her, his gaze steady and reassuring. "Not if I can help it. But I'm not letting him run you off." Just then, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Silas looked out the window. It was Henderson, and this time he brought 2 hard-faced men with him, both wearing guns. They reined in 20 yards from the cabin, their posture aggressive and confident. The showdown had arrived. Silas looked at Clara, at the terror in her eyes. He gave her a small, firm nod, a silent promise. Then he opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, letting the screen door swing shut behind him. He stood there, bathed in the harsh afternoon sun, his hands loose at his sides. "Wallace," Henderson bellowed, dismounting. "Time's up. I'm here for my money or my land." "The lady's been sick," Silas called back, his voice calm and even, carrying easily in the still air. "She needs more time." Henderson laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I'm not running a charity, and I don't negotiate with hired guns. I want you off my property, Kane. Then I'll deal with the woman." He started walking toward the porch, his hired men fanning out behind him. "You're not setting foot in this house," Silas said. The words were not a threat, just a statement of fact. "And you're going to stop me?" Henderson sneered, stopping 10 feet away. His hand drifted toward the pistol on his hip. "I heard stories about you, Kane. They say you're fast. But you're not faster than 3 men." The cabin door opened again. Clara stepped out, Elodie right behind her. Clara stood beside Silas, her body frail but her spine straight. She held a heavy cast-iron skillet in one hand, her only weapon. Elodie stood on his other side. Her small chin jutted out defiantly. They were a strange, motley line of defense, a weary gunslinger, a recovering widow, and a slip of a girl. "This is my home, Mr. Henderson," Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. "My husband died breaking this land. I nearly died holding on to it. I'm not leaving." Henderson's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful. I should have thrown you out months ago." Silas took a half step forward, drawing Henderson's attention back to him. The 2 hired guns tensed, their hands hovering over their own weapons. The air grew thick and heavy, the world shrinking to the space between the porch and the 3 men. This was the moment it all came down to, the moment that usually ended in smoke and blood. But Silas didn't draw. He didn't even look at his gun. He looked directly into Henderson's eyes. "You could try," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, conversational tone that was more menacing than any shout. "You could try to draw on me. Maybe you'd get lucky. Maybe your friends would get lucky. But word travels fast out here, Henderson. Word is a known gunslinger was living peaceably, helping a sick widow and her child. And then the landowner shows up with hired muscle, and all 3 of them end up dead. And you walk away with their land." He let the words hang in the air. "People might get the wrong idea," he continued, a cold smile touching his lips. "Accidents happen to greedy men. Horses throw shoes. Snakes get in bedrolls. Fires start for no reason. This is a hard country. It would be a shame if your luck ran out." It was a masterful performance. He hadn't threatened him directly, not in a way the law could touch. He had simply painted a picture of a future Henderson didn't want to imagine, leveraging the very reputation Clara had feared. The 2 hired men exchanged a nervous glance. This wasn't what they'd signed up for. They were bullies, not men willing to get into a blood feud with Silas Kane. Henderson's bravado began to crumble. He looked from Silas's unblinking stare to the wavering confidence of his men. He saw Clara's iron resolve and the little girl's unwavering glare. He was outmaneuvered, not by a gun, but by an idea, by the power of a reputation and the unshakable unity of the family standing before him. "This ain't over," he snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. He was trying to save face. "Give her an extension," Silas said, pressing his advantage. "A real one. Let her get her strength back, get a crop in. She'll pay you what she owes when she can." Henderson glared at him, his face flushed with humiliation. He knew he was beaten. "Fine," he spat. 6 months. But after that, I want my money." He stormed back to his horse, mounted up, and rode away without a backward glance. His 2 men, looking visibly relieved, were right behind him. Silence descended on the homestead, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the sound of the wind whispering through the dry grass. The threat was gone. They had won. Clara let out a long, shuddering breath, and the heavy skillet slipped from her grasp, clanging onto the porch. She sagged against the doorframe, the fight draining out of her. Elodie rushed to her side. Silas stood watching the dust settle on the horizon. He had faced down 3 men without firing a shot. He had defended a home. He felt a profound sense of rightness, a feeling so alien it was almost painful. He turned and looked at Clara and Elodie. The question of his future hung unspoken in the air between them. His purpose here was served. The road was waiting. Clara met his gaze. The fear in her eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet gratitude. But there was something else there, too. A question, an invitation. She pushed herself upright, her strength returning with her resolve. She didn't plead or beg him to stay. Her pride wouldn't allow it. Instead, she gave him a choice, a chance to choose a different path. "The roof over the stable has a leak," she said, her voice soft but steady. "And the back fence still needs mending. If you're staying." It wasn't a request for a handyman. It was an offer of a place, a role, a life. Silas looked past her, toward the endless horizon that had been his only companion for so long. He saw the lonely campfires, the empty towns, the years stretching out into a bleak and solitary future. Then he looked back at the small, sturdy cabin. He saw the woman who had fought her way back from death, and the fierce little girl who had dragged him out of his own self-imposed exile. He saw the pot of wildflowers on the windowsill, a stubborn splash of color in a world of brown. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He walked past her, picked up the axe he had dropped earlier, and headed toward the woodpile. The solid, rhythmic thud of the axe splitting wood began to echo through the quiet afternoon. Elodie, a rare, brilliant smile spreading across her face, ran to the chicken coop to scatter feed. Clara remained on the porch, her hand resting on the doorframe, and watched him. She watched the powerful swing of his arms, the steady purpose in his work. He wasn't Silas Kane, the gunslinger, anymore. He was just a man, mending a fence, repairing a life, not just hers, but his own. The setting sun cast his long shadow across the yard, and for the first time in a decade, it looked like the shadow of a man who was finally home. He looks up from his work, the axe resting on the chopping block. The sun is low, painting the clouds in hues of orange and violet. Elodie is chasing a chicken near the coop, her laughter a sound as clear and bright as creek water. On the porch, Clara is humming a quiet tune as she mends one of his shirts, the needle moving with a practiced grace. He watches them, this small, resilient family that he has somehow become a part of. The urge to ride on, the restless ghost that has driven him for so long, is finally quiet. He looks at the horizon, not with a wanderer's longing, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knows what lies on the other side of his own fence. He came here to disappear, to fade into nothing. Instead, he was found. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.